Thank you for listening to the sermon podcast for Sunday, January 31st, 2016. The sermon for this morning is based on Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 to 13. A reading from Corinthians. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way, it is not irritable or resentful. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly. But then we will see, face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, for the sermon this morning, we will focus on the second reading, which is Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, especially how Paul describes love. And it's both good news, the good news of how God loves us through Jesus Christ, and also about how God's love for us compels us to live as the church. So as a way of getting into this, just a little bit about a singer-songwriter that I enjoy. Mason Jennings is his name, and he's got a song called If You Ain't Got Love that will help us get into this reading. Mason Jennings is a bit of a... Pause here. Okay, so where were we? We were talking about Mason Jennings and his song, If I Ain't Got Love. And I was about to tell you that in my wilder, younger days, my good friend Terry and I, we snuck into a Mason Jennings concert. And we had to do this by pretending to be students at Hamline University. And we were able to get in to this little student center where he was going to put on a show, which I realized, it's pretty crazy stuff. But he has this song called If I Ain't Got Love. And one of the reasons I like this song is it's not one of these kind of surface-level cliche pop love songs that's really just about infatuation, but it's about what love does to our heart, what it demands of us. And in this song, in the second verse, he writes about the birth of his child and how in the moment of his child's birth there was these immediate health problems. And so the song goes like this. I'm going to speak it because he sings in a unique way, kind of like Dylan or something. So he writes, At 9 a.m, after 9 months of waiting, you were born and I saw your face and you looked up at me. But before I could hold you, the doctors raced you from me. They told me that you might not live, your heart was not healthy. And with wires coming from you, I sat beside you. I'm never going to give you up. What do you got if you ain't got love? If you ain't got love, what do you got if you ain't got love? Right? And it captures the essence of it. A parent whose heart is breaking open simply because a new child has come into the world, and also the fear of these pending health issues. And while his heart is breaking open, he makes a promise. I'm never going to give you up. Right? And that gets at the essence of what we hear in this passage from Paul. God's promise to us is, I'm never going to give you up. And we're called as Christians to make these same kinds of promises to each other as the church and how we live our lives as well. And it's risky to make such a promise. It demands such a great deal of our heart and our being and of our lives. And yet that's what we're called to be about as Christians. So whatever happens in your life, whatever comes your way, we can trust that God borrows this song lyric from Mason Jennings. And God's song to you is always, I'm never going to give you up. This is the message of the cross, of Jesus' death, and of his resurrection. It assures us that God's song to you is always, I'm never going to give you up. And so Paul calls upon us as the church, as folks who've received this love from God, to love in a similar way. In this passage from 1 Corinthians 13, he wrote it to a church that wasn't getting along very well. He wrote it to a new church in the town of Corinth, and he wrote it because people were fighting over who knew more stuff. They were competing over who was baptized by who, and maybe who was closer to this leader or that leader. Paul is writing to a fractured, fighting church. Now, we most often hear this passage at weddings, and that's a good place for it as well. But it's helpful to recall that the initial intended audience was a church that was not getting along so well. And so Paul is calling this church to be a community of people that practices love. A community of people that love in the same way that God has loved us as Christians. To put it one way, Paul is calling upon us to say to one another, I'm never going to give you up, even though you're really annoying me right now. Even though we're not getting along, I'm still going to make this promise to you of I'm never going to give you up, because our God made that same promise to us in Jesus Christ. So that's who we're called to be as the church, and this is an example, I think, of what this kind of promise can look like when the church lives this out. And this comes from a story that was on NPR recently, and it was about a group of teenage boys in the Boston area who volunteered to be pallbearers for Nicholas Miller. Now, we don't really know anything about Nicholas Miller other than that at the time of his death, there was no family, no next of kin, or no friends who came forward to identify themselves as his family members or his friends. And so the funeral home reached out to the local Catholic high school and asked these boys to come and volunteer and be the pallbearers for this service. So this group of teenage boys, they showed up, they were dressed in their suits and their ties, they carried his simple coffin, and they held a service for him. And they spoke these words. The young men said, "We are here to bear witness to the life and passing of Nicholas Miller. He died alone with no family to comfort him, but today we are his family, we are his sons." Right? This is what the church does. Right? This is who the church is called to be there and say, today we are his family. We don't really know anything about Mr. Miller, why it was that at the time of his death he didn't have any family or friends. Perhaps they all died before him. Perhaps he burned a lot of bridges. Maybe he wasn't a nice guy. We don't know. Those volunteers, those young men, they didn't know either. But nevertheless, they showed up to speak God's words through their actions of I'm never going to give you up. It's who we're called to be as the church. And so Paul in this letter describes a love that's active, a love that does things. According to scholars who are good at Greek, they tell us that sometimes the English passage can be a little bit almost static sounding, because it almost sounds like we're just describing love. Love is patient. Love is kind. But that the Greek conveys more of an active love. Love shows patience. Love does acts of kindness. Love bears all things. So Paul is calling us to live a love, to live through our words and our deeds this promise of I'm never going to give you up. And we're called to say that to one another as the church. And as the church, we're also called to live this promise of God's promise, of faithfulness, of never giving up on folks to the world. Paul calls us as the church to be different. It says there is something different about us as the church. And this comes first and foremost through our belief that we are a group of people who are on the receiving end of a love we did nothing to earn. We believe humbly and gratefully that God's gift for us in Jesus Christ is unconditional love for us, that we've been raised to new life with Christ, but we didn't do anything to earn this. We don't have to keep doing stuff to deserve it. We are a community of people who've been on the receiving end of God's promise, I'm never going to give you up. And so then Paul says, therefore, as recipients of this promise, as believers in a God who loves in this way, we are called to be people who live and love in the same way. When I meet with the parents of our confirmation youth, and our confirmation is for 7th and 8th graders, it's a program to help them nurture their faith life, and to grow in their faith life, grow in their participation in the life of the church. But when I meet with the parents at the very beginning, I always say what I hope the youth experience. I hope that they experience being part of a community that's different, within their confirmation group, but also in the larger group, that they experience being part of a group that supports each other, that cares for each other, that's there for each other on good days and bad days, that's willing to stand up for each other, that's willing to just be there as a listening ear, a supporting friend. I hope that they experience that the church is different. It's a group that's not contingent upon having mutual likes or having the same clothes or looking the same, but a commitment to loving as we've been loved. And all of us, our youth and all of us, are part of groups and communities in which our membership is conditional. It's based on looking like everyone else, sounding like everyone else. It's based on our performance, based on our ability to hit a ball equally well as everyone else in the group, or play a musical instrument equally as well as everyone else in the group. Whether that's our job or the neighborhood we live in, the house we live in, the groups we run with, most of the groups that were part of our membership is conditional. Paul reminds us that the church is different. It doesn't function this way. We're part of a community that is loved by God through the gift of Jesus Christ. All of us have been on the receiving end and are continually on the receiving end of God's faithful promise to us of, I'm never going to give you up. So then Paul says, as a group of people, we're called to have this same faithfulness to one another. I have a little note here from one of our confirmation students. This was last year from Maggie Powell, and she was writing a note as a thank you letter to the church, our church. And she says, our church has a great bond, and we've got each other's back. Right? That's Maggie's way of saying, I'm never going to give you up. We've got each other's back. She has experienced it, right? There is something different about being part of the church. So because we believe in a God who makes a promise to us, we're called to make that same promise to one another and to the world. To be signs in the world of God's faithfulness of I'm never going to give you up, whether people seem to have it together or seem to be struggling, whether it's people we like or don't like, we're still called to be God's promise in the world, to be a sign of the cross of I'm never going to give you up. So we've reached the part of the service where now we've got to move around and do something kind of uncomfortable. But what I'd like you to do is try to get around the whole room. There's no rush here. There's no football today. Try to get around the whole room and maybe put your hand on that person's shoulder, look them in the eye and say, I'm never going to give you up. You're speaking this on behalf of God as someone who's received that same promise. You might not know the names of everyone you're saying this to, but that's okay. There's a good chance that the person you say this to might be voting for a different presidential candidate than you, might be a fan of a different sports team than you, might like different hymnody than you. But none of that is the source of our unity. The source of our unity as the church is that we've been loved by God through Christ Jesus, and that we're called to love one another, to make this promise to each other no matter what. So if you would, go around. And then also, just keep in mind, it's one thing to do this in a room of people that seems kind of safe because, well, we're all here at the same time. We must have some things in common. But we're also called to do this outside the walls of this church. Now, maybe that doesn't mean going up to someone on the sidewalk and putting your hand on their shoulder and saying, I'm never going to give you up. But there might be a time when that's appropriate with a friend or something. But maybe just don't surprise a stranger with that. However, maybe we do it in the way we live and act and treat that person. We live that same promise from God. So we're practicing it here, and we're going to live it here, but we're also called to live it out there. So at this time, seriously, get up, go around, and the words are, I'm never going to give you up. Try to get around, not just the person sitting next to you, the whole congregation.